move to our next presenter, who I'm really pleased. Hello there, Matt. Welcome. So Matt Stempeck comes from to us from as the founder, creator of the Civic Tech Field Guide. And the Civic Tech Field is a little bit more mature than the peace tech use of deliberative technologies conversation that we've just had, right? And so it's really exciting for you to come here. Tell us a bit, where are we at on the learning curve on civic tech and engaging citizens to create trusting, participatory, meaningful relationships? And what should we be paying attention to as we think about how we adapt and apply those? So I know you have lots to share, Matt, so go right ahead.
Thanks so much. Yeah, the Civic Tech Field's been around a little while, it goes by different names, but I think we're only can be judged by how well we learn from what we've done. So hopefully we can all collaborate on that. And I think there's a lot of overlap with peace building, especially from the presentations that I've heard today. I'm just going to drop my links in the chat here so folks can drive along at home as well. Okay, so while I'm doing that, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Matt Stempeck. I wish I could be with you in person today. I'm based here in Lisbon, Portugal, but I spent 9 years in Washington, D.C., and I really wish I could be there. My career has been basically civic tech, using the internet and whatever new tech is available for public interest goals. That's included, U.S. presidential campaigns, nonprofit tech in Washington, D.C., academia, big tech platforms like Google and Microsoft, trying to embed civic engagement in products that billions of people use. So basically just trying to, get towards public interest goals like peace building with any new resources we have available. My take on it is that we're often under-resourced in our fields. So anytime we can use tech as a leveraging point, that's great. What the Civic Tech Field Guide is basically a living library of those kinds of solutions. And we've been doing this since 2016. And it's now over 8,500 hand-categorized projects and organizations in the field. Don't worry, the digital participation platforms that I'm going to talk about today is a smaller subset of that. But yeah, you can find all of them there. This is me. My email address is matt@civictech.guide, and I'll drop the link in the chat. We also do research on top of all this. So the research I'll talk about today about digital participation platforms is one example where we use our database of all these civic tech tools to learn and see, our work is so important in these fields. And so how do we get better at this work? How do we learn from what's worked and what hasn't? And so this graveyard here on the right is an example of that, where we basically created a place where we can visit the projects that are no longer with us, especially those that maybe had a lot of funding or media attention, but still didn't work. And we also collect the postmortems that founders write, where they say what went wrong. And we want to learn, is there a certain category of thing that doesn't work, or how can we do it better or differently next time? And that's kind of why the Civic Tech Field Guide exists, is so we can get better at our work. So what I want to talk about right now is digital participation platforms. And, these can be explicit platforms like the ones on the right here. We've got a couple open source examples and a couple for-profit company examples. These platforms basically let people, like Remesh, they let people generate ideas and vote on projects and work together and team up on initiatives. You can do participatory budgeting, so deciding where public funds go. Some of these platforms have modules to let people debate each other or co-author legislation sometimes. But generally, they let you participate in public life through digital channels. A lot of them are used in cities at that level. But this guide that I wrote with People Powered, is explicitly for anyone inside any institution or group that wants to engage the public and basically start shifting power to their constituents or the public for decision making. So we often consider them as distinct websites, but many are actually just, a process or a collection of tools that let us achieve that, public engagement. It doesn't have to be one brand, although sometimes one brand is really convenient depending where you're coming from. And so we did this research and kind of did an overview scan of just global participation platforms and how they're being used in different countries around the world. because there's hundreds of them, as I mentioned, so it's kind of hard to keep track. We want to know, things like accessibility and security. Are there certifications for that? And in many cases there are. And then also, what features are available? What do they let you do as a citizen or a constituent? So a lot of thought has gone into these platforms. I think collectively they've engaged millions of members of the public. So, what can we learn from that over time? They tailor it over time as well. And yeah, so as I mentioned, the growing number, there's also more visibility. This actually is an industry, it's a business sector of the software world, is building these participation platforms. In Europe here, there's even a trade alliance for these companies, the Alliance for Civic Tech Europe, which I think is a great sign that this sector is getting more mature. And I mentioned there's also open source ones. I'm really a big fan of these ones like Decidum and Console, where multiple different cities are teaming up to collaborate and build the software together so that no one city has to, maintain a whole software platform by themselves. So it's a booming area of development. A lot of people are using them and engaging on them. And depending on the use case, you might, need one or the other. And that's why we wrote this guide. I'm not, an open source zealot. I'm not an only for-profit person. I think depending on, how big your tech team is and what, you want to get done, there's different solutions for different needs. And that's kind of what this guide covers. We heard that distinct desire, and together with People Powered, we kind of wrote this guide to how to, select a platform, how to set it up, given your context and constraints. And then also just like how to run a truly participatory program on one of these sites or platforms in a way that actually shifts power and isn't just about participation for participation's sake. So this field is advancing really rapidly. Okay, and so I'll just go quick. This is the guide here, and you can see the URL here. I'll also put it in the chat. This is basically a free online resource hosted over at People Powered. People Powered also helped me connect with their global community to learn a lot more of different contexts. I learned about participatory budgeting at the local level in China. I talked to a group in Chile that used to build distinct platforms like this and now engages people entirely on WhatsApp to get over the hurdle of, having to register for another website. And a lot of their constituents they were talking to didn't have email addresses to begin with. So we looked at a really global mix of different ways people are doing this kind of public engagement. Let's see, just advance this slide. And then there's the Civic Tech Field guide I mentioned. This you can see as like People Powered has this overall guide. They've also built an online course that's free and self-guided based on this guide, so you can go through it piece by piece. And People Powered also does annual ratings of the platforms now, which is really helpful, to begin to sort out some of these hundreds of offerings. The Civic Tech Field Guide, which I work on full time, is sort of a living library. Platform developers and others have crowdsourced all these different examples. And the one thing I'll highlight for this group is that you can use our advanced filters. So if you want to find a platform that's based in the country that you're interested in, you can do that. You can also filter for whether it's open source or not and things like that. And then there's usually direct links to the GitHub repository if it's open source. So you can go ahead and check out the code or fork the code. But yeah, and then lastly, I mentioned we do a lot of research and that lives there too. And you can also get contact information for the platform developers. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for some reflections on this space, and then also, of course, the Q&A and just discussion. Before I do that, this is just a link to our newsletter sign up. Every week we share jobs, new product launches, so new platforms launching, and features like that, and then an open community calendar of funding and events and conferences like this one. And so I'll just maybe reflect a little bit on this digital participation platform genre of technology and what we can learn from, over 15 years of work in this space. I mentioned, millions of people use these platforms. It's a real, substantial thing. It's, in the scheme of the world, it's not everyone, but it's not insignificant either. I think the most common challenges to setting these up are often, I mentioned the registration barrier. So just like getting people to sign up for yet one more thing. Many of us in the civic and public spheres and peace tech don't always have a huge marketing budget to compete with other apps. And so that's why I always get excited when I learn about groups that are using apps that people already have. Like I mentioned, the WhatsApp example in Chile. It doesn't have to be WhatsApp, but this idea of engaging people where they are versus another platform. And the V Taiwan example, which is a famous example out of Taiwan, they actually strung together a whole bunch of different tools to come up with a participatory process where the public and other stakeholders got to engage. And the process is really powerful, and there's been many case studies about it, but it didn't depend on any one platform. They were able to use lots of different tools. I think, though, the biggest impediment to this whole sector and field being meaningful is that many times the decisions that the public is invited to co-create on are either low-level decisions, like you can design a public park together, and not the really contentious decisions that are often more meaningful. And too often leaders of institutions, they want the participation, or they allow the participation, and they want to show engagement, but they don't always connect it to anything on the other end. And I've actually participated in some things like this here in Europe, where I weigh in, I take my time to fill out their forms and go to their website and sign up, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's a great way to burn communities that have already been burned before, and it makes it just harder to engage them next time. So I think it's really important that we connect any kind of digital engagement to a meaningful real-world connection. There are some great examples of that. One just immediate one is Consul in Madrid. For a period of time, it was a digital platform, and if enough residents of Madrid voted for a policy online, it became the city law through the city council. And it happened about twice, I think, with 32,000 online votes for something. But that's just a clear example where your online participation is really meaningful. And participatory budgeting is another one. You're spending real public money, and your online platform engagement helps decide where that money goes. So having a concrete connection. And then just some other great examples of these digital participation platforms. AI keeps coming up, but this platform Polis, POL.is, Polis, uses AI to map the areas of consensus between rival stakeholder groups. So you can start really difficult compromise conversations from a place of actual shared values, rather than, as we think about social media and many forms of technology where we're often focusing on our differences. Polis has been used quite successfully in a number of different contexts to kind of hone in on that overlap in our values. And that's, I think, also quite relevant for peace building. And that Polis team is also advising OpenAI now on some of their AI governance work, which gives me some hope for that. And then some other interesting platforms. There are some like Delib, like deliberative, and Popbox in the US that were actually designed by, congressional parliamentary staffers themselves. So they're aware of how citizen engagement and feedback kind of sometimes dies in the bureaucracy. And they design their platform so that the internal tools for the people running the platform helps that citizen feedback survive its journey through the bureaucratic channels. So in general, I'm just inspired by this field, and a lot of these platforms are building new features all the time and finding ways to, find common ground between rival groups and basically help relatively small groups of people make decisions together in a better way. And then just lastly, reflecting on where these platforms might be going in the future. I definitely think this era of trying to get people to participate for the sake of it needs to end. I think we need to show the connection between people's engagement and something happening in their immediate world. I think people are rightfully jaded by just being asked to engage with no connection to power. And then just another AI example, a lot of these platform developers are actively integrating AI features. And on the one hand, this could be a great thing. Many members of, for example, city government staffers, they're very busy. And if engaging the public means something like 40,000 pages of text comments from the public, it makes it harder to do that frequently. And if AI can, adequately, concisely summarize the different points people are making, that could help us, run these processes more often and engage the public more frequently. So that could be promising. But we also know that large language learning models are large learning models are not always great at their summarization. They sometimes look like they summarize something perfectly and actually left something out. And I'm worried that we won't always audit that and see that that happened. And the other major issue with AI, of course, is we have certain channels for public comment and public participation. And it's already increasingly easy to astroturf and spoof participation and engagement on those channels, not just with text, but as we're seeing more and more examples of with video, with audio, with voice. And very few of our public channels are currently inoculated and ready for that kind of thing. So I'm a little worried about that. I think we really need to bolster and rethink how we engage the public in this era of generative AI, where it's just very easy to make it look like there's a groundswell of public support for something there might not be. So I'm sorry for speaking so fast. I'm excited about this topic, but I want to, open up the floor to actually talk back and forth instead of me chatting with you. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. If people have comments online, please go ahead and write them in. Let's take a couple questions in the room. Yes, Chip?
So, Matt, I have a history of asking unfair questions, and I'm about to give you the worst one I've ever given. It comes out of a discussion we had during the break, which you weren't at for obvious reasons. And we were talking about the potential for-profits in this space. And as we were talking, I forgot to mention there's a group called mediate.com, which has a European counterpart, iCoder, that comes out of the online dispute resolution world, and they're pretty clearly for profit. But as we think about partnering with for-profits, which I think we need to do, what has been your experience? Because some of the groups I know that you talked about, I know of as at least being vaguely for-profit. So what has that relationship been like? Have there been pitfalls that you would warn us about?
Thank you. I don't think that's an unfair question at all. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, let me add one question as well. And then again, if others have questions, feel free. The idea of civic tech in democracy, I wonder whether or not more of them are based on kind of the idea of majority rule. And that when we look at Polis or others, that as peace builders, we should kind of lean into those that are specifically designed to try to surface that invisible common ground, those areas of consensus. So if you have thoughts there as well. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. So just on the private sector question, I mentioned I'm sort of agnostic depending on the context, and the question about data privacy came up in the previous session. I think that's maybe the most important factor here. But I also see there are often benefits for private sector companies selling these platforms, and public benefits. Just one example, there's great open source platforms, but not everyone in every office of an institution is ready to spin up a server and configure some software. And in addition to running the program, like it might be one person running the program with a public program, much less the technical side. And in that case, I think a software as a service business model, which many of these companies do, a monthly fee, they do all the hosting, they do the security patches, right? I think that can be a great boon to a small public sector team that just doesn't have the resources. Whereas if you did have, some software developers on your team or some IT support, it might make more sense to do an open source one where you can totally customize exactly how you want it. So there's pros and cons, but I'm not against the private sector ones. And one other example from the US, this company Neighborland, which was eventually acquired by Nextdoor. But when you talk about, how do we reach diverse, groups online, which, to be honest, the civic tech space has failed in many cases to do, and it can be challenging. Neighborland, from a very private sector perspective, they were like, we advertise and we use online ad tools to over-index on groups that don't normally show up to participate on these kinds of platforms. And they were able to reach, very large numbers of participation and very diverse and representative demographically of the communities they were in. So I think there can be benefits to the private sector. I think, but paying attention to accessibility, security, and also data treatment are important factors, of course. And then in terms of the majority rules question, yeah, in this last link I shared is the full guide, but I go into more detail there on sort of the different mechanisms, and they're kind of modules or features of these different platforms. Some are really common, like the upvoting where just majority wins. Others are more balanced and interesting, and that I spent more time on those because they're rare. The delib example I gave, they're based in the UK, they work in Commonwealth situations, but they had one tool that's just called like the simulator. And so it's very easy from the outside to be like, why is government cutting budget for the thing I like? The simulator was like, okay, citizen, here's the budget, here's some sliders, how would you prioritize the budget? And the simulator forced citizens to make trade-offs. You couldn't have everything. And just that simple act of empathy was powerful for me, of putting people in a real world situation instead of a dream car situation. So I'm really interested in features like that, and non-majority rule features where it begins to resemble the actual challenges that decision makers face. And then the more the public can be familiar with that and get to engage in that, maybe the more understanding we have. I don't know.
Absolutely. Okay, let's maybe take one last question from the room. Excellent, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. In your guide, did you also talk about how much like tech investment or facilitation investment are required depending on this model? Because I think earlier we talked about sometimes how long it takes to get it right and what kind of collaboration it gets. So I think when we apply this, I think that would be something interesting for a lot of our colleagues applying those tools. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So in that same people-powered guide, we talk about budgets for sure, because it's such a huge factor. And that's also why I often emphasize building the practice and just the methodology within your office or organization of doing this, of engaging the public in some way, that over time you can iterate and add tech to. But I think that's like that, and maybe you're already there, but that practice is the hard part, I think, more than paying a $50 or however much per month service. And some of the best, vTaiwan, some of the best, most cited examples in this field use like Typeform and Google Docs and just cobble together different services. So it's not, the bells and whistles are nice and you might need them in some cases, but they're not always necessary.